In this video, I want to talk about the reflexive property in proofs. I think that aside from givens, I think the reflexive property might be some students' favorite reason because you can just spot it in the proof and say, that's going to use the reflexive property. The reflexive property just says that something is congruent to itself. Anything, any side, any angle has got to be congruent to itself. If you measure a side, it's going to be the same length as if you measure that side because it's the same side. I like to think of the reflexive property as thinking of a reflection, that you've got the same thing on both sides of that congruent sign. So it's like that congruent sign is a mirror and you've got the thing looking at its reflection. And when you think of reflection, think of reflexive because that's the reflexive property. Let's see some places where we would use it in a proof because everything is congruent to itself, but there are only some times when that's a helpful thing to bring into a proof. All right, so here is a case where we want to prove that two triangles are congruent. And let me use my highlighter. So we want to say that ABD, which is that triangle right there, is congruent to CDB, which is this triangle right here. All right. So you can see in step 4, we already proved that these two angles are congruent to each other. We also had given that these two sides were congruent to each other. So we've got two pieces of evidence about these two triangles. Where am I going to find my third piece of evidence? Well, I noticed looking at this diagram that the diagonal BD is in both of the triangles. So this is a side of the yellow triangle and it's a side of the pink triangle. So in this case, noticing that it's congruent to itself is going to help us prove that an extra side of the yellow triangle is congruent to a side of the pink triangle. So that, looking at that diagram and thinking about the two triangles I need to prove that are congruent and noticing they have a side in common is enough for me to say, I'm going to want to say that BD is congruent to BD. And the reason for that, like I said, just like this is a mirror that's showing BD its reflection, that reminds me of the reflexive property. We very rarely talk about two angles being congruent to each other by the reflexive property, but it can happen. Let me give you an example of this diagram right here. I'm not going to go into this proof in any detail, but I've got this triangle and I'm given that this side is congruent to this side and that D is the midpoint of this side and E is the midpoint of this side. And I want to prove, once again, I'm getting out my highlighters. Notice how I do things like this so that I can see what I need to do in my proof. I need to prove that triangle ABE is congruent to triangle ACD. So A to C to D and back. All right. So let's think about what kind of evidence we have in this proof. We were told that side AB is congruent to side AC, so that's one yellow side and one pink side being congruent. We could use these midpoints to do various things, but in this case, the third piece of evidence that we're going to use is notice how angle A is in both of these triangles. So I'm going to want to say in this proof at some point that angle A is congruent to angle A. And the reason for that is because, once again, it's the same thing on both sides of the congruent sign. So the congruent sign is like a mirror. Reflexive property. So I hope that gives you some reason of why you're going to think about the reflexive property when you're looking at a proof. The reflexive property is going to happen when you're looking at triangles you need to prove are congruent and you notice that the same side or the same angle is in both of those triangles. Then you can use the reflexive property to make it clear that that common side is congruent to itself.